3 days ago, something happened that most people completely missed. And honestly, you cannot blame them because on the surface it looked like nothing. No explosions, no dramatic footage, no breaking news alerts flashing across every screen. Just a group of men in business suits walking into a conference room in Geneva, Switzerland. But what those men did inside that room sent a shockwave through Tehran, caught the United States government completely off guard, and may have just redirected the most dangerous conflict the world has seen in decades. Those men were representatives of the Gulf states: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman. Countries that had spent nearly 4 weeks absorbing Iranian missiles and drones. Countries that lost airports, oil facilities, and billions of dollars in damage while desperately trying to stay out of a war they never asked for. And inside that meeting room in Geneva, they did not reach for weapons. They did not threaten to bomb anyone. They pulled out something far more powerful. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what they did, why it worked, and why even Washington did not see it coming. For years, the United States and Iran had been locked in a dangerous standoff over one core issue. Iran was building a nuclear program that Washington believed was heading toward weapons-grade capability. America kept saying stop or face consequences. Iran kept pushing forward. Both sides knew that if diplomacy failed completely, the next step was war. So in early 2026, something genuinely surprising happened. Both sides actually sat down to negotiate in a serious way. Real talks, real progress. Meetings in Switzerland, back-channel conversations facilitated through Oman, multiple governments working as go-betweens to keep both sides at the table. And according to diplomats who were inside those rooms, it was actually working. Right before everything collapsed, Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi publicly announced that a breakthrough had been reached. Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium. Iran had agreed to full verification by the international nuclear watchdog. Iran had agreed to irreversibly downgrade its enriched uranium to the lowest level possible. Al-Busaidi said peace was, quote, within reach. The next round of talks was scheduled for March 2nd. For people who had been watching the Iran situation for years, this was genuinely stunning. These were not vague promises or preliminary discussions. These were concrete technical commitments with verification mechanisms attached. The hard part had been done. All that remained was formalizing it. And then, on the night of February 28, 2026, the bombs started falling. The night everything changed. The United States and Israel launched a massive, coordinated military strike on Iran, all at once, in the middle of the night. Operations Epic Fury and Roaring Lion, as they were later named, hit dozens of targets simultaneously. Nuclear facilities destroyed. Missile factories bombed. Military installations struck across multiple Iranian cities. No final warning, no last chance at the table. And in the opening minutes of the assault, Iran's supreme leader, the man who had been running the country for over 3 decades, was killed at his office in Tehran. Iran hits everyone. Within hours of the American and Israeli strikes, Iran launched a massive retaliation. Hundreds of missiles and drones fired at once in multiple directions at multiple countries simultaneously. But here is the detail that changed everything. Iran did not only target Israel, it did not only target American military installations, it went after every single Gulf country that allows American forces to operate from its soil. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman. All 6 members of the Gulf Cooperation Council struck in a single night. That had never happened before in the entire modern history of the Middle East. Not once. Iran had always been careful to avoid directly attacking its Gulf neighbors at this scale. That calculation, that restraint, that tacit understanding that these countries were a different category from Iran's direct enemies, ended completely on February 28th. Iran's military logic was brutal in its simplicity. These countries host American bases. American forces use those bases to help coordinate the strikes on Iran. That makes them legitimate targets. The damage was immediate and serious. In the UAE, Abu Dhabi's international airport was targeted. Dubai International, normally the busiest airport in the entire world, was hit by a drone that caused a massive fire at a nearby fuel storage facility. Flights across the whole region were grounded. Black smoke rising over the famous Dubai skyline went viral globally within minutes. In Kuwait, missiles struck American military facilities and oil infrastructure. The U.S. embassy there took a direct hit and was immediately evacuated. In Bahrain, where the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet is headquartered, explosions were reported close to the main naval base. In Qatar, home to the largest American air base in the entire Middle East, residents of Doha described sounds they had never experienced in their lives. And it did not stop after that first night. For 4 consecutive weeks, the strikes kept coming. The UAE alone absorbed more than 2,000 separate Iranian strikes across the conflict. 2,000, against a country that was not even a party to the war. Saudi Arabia's air defenses were intercepting waves of Iranian drones almost daily. Kuwait's oil refinery was hit and had to shut operations. The economic damage was mounting every single day, while the world held its breath waiting to see how long the Gulf states could keep absorbing punishment before they snapped. But the answer to that question was not what anyone expected, and it starts with a narrow strip of water that most people had never thought about before this war. The waterway that runs the world. On March 2nd, Iran made an announcement that triggered immediate panic in every financial market on the planet. Iran declared that the Strait of Hormuz was closed. If you have never focused on that name before, here is why it matters so much. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage of water sitting between Iran on one side and the Arabian Peninsula on the other. At its tightest point, it is only about 33 kilometers wide. And through that tiny corridor, roughly 20% of all the oil and gas in the entire world passes every single day. Saudi oil, Iraqi oil, UAE oil, Kuwaiti oil, Qatari natural gas. All of it travels through the Strait of Hormuz on its way to Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world. There is no alternative route that can carry that volume. There is no backup plan that kicks in overnight. If that waterway closes, the global energy supply starts running short almost immediately. The reaction was instant. Oil tankers stopped moving. Shipping companies issued emergency alerts and turned vessels around. Insurance companies refused to cover any ship that attempted to pass through, and oil prices detonated. Before the war, crude was trading at around $65 a barrel. After the Hormuz closure announcement, it shot past $94 a barrel. That is close to a 60% price increase in less than 2 weeks. Economists called it the biggest disruption to global energy supply in 50 years. The last time anything this severe hit world energy markets was the oil embargo of the 1970s, half a century ago. And you felt this whether you realized it or not. In America, petrol prices jumped nearly a full dollar per gallon in under a month. In Europe, energy bills started climbing again just when people thought costs were finally stabilizing. In Pakistan, India, Japan, South Korea, and dozens of other nations that depend entirely on imported energy from the Gulf, governments held emergency meetings and began drawing down strategic fuel reserves just to slow the damage. Airlines calculated whether they could keep flying at current prices. Factories raised prices because production and shipping costs exploded. And when it costs more to make and ship everything, food prices follow. Every person in every country that buys fuel or groceries felt the direct impact of those 4 words from an Iranian commander. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. But as devastating as the Hormuz closure was, Iran was not done demonstrating exactly how much damage it could inflict. And what came next pushed the entire crisis into genuinely uncharted territory. The warning that scared governments. More than any missile, Israel had struck one of Iran's major natural gas facilities, South Pars, as part of its military campaign. Iran's response was to target Qatar's Ras Laffan complex, which is the largest liquefied natural gas export terminal on the face of the earth. Qatar supplies natural gas to Japan, South Korea, and multiple European nations that have built entire energy systems around Qatari LNG. The strike caused serious damage and sent global gas prices surging on top of everything that was already happening to oil markets. But the strike itself was not the most alarming part. Before attacking the Ras Laffan complex, Iran sent evacuation warnings to the governments of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. It told them to clear their energy facilities. At first glance, that sounds like a courtesy. It was not. It was something far more disturbing. It was a calculated demonstration of intelligence and capability. The message Iran was sending was not about being careful or avoiding civilian casualties. The message was this: we know the exact location of every power plant, every gas terminal, every desalination facility in your country. We can strike any of them at any moment we choose. This time, we gave you the chance to move your people out. The unspoken second sentence of that message was obvious to every Gulf government that received it. Next time, there may not be a warning. That single act scared Gulf governments more deeply than the 4 weeks of incoming missiles had. Because missiles are a military threat. You can shoot them down, activate air defenses, harden targets, and rebuild what they damage. But this warning was something different. It was Iran demonstrating that it had already mapped every critical vulnerability in Gulf infrastructure and could act on that knowledge at will. In a region where some populations depend entirely on desalination plants for drinking water, the threat is not just economic. It is existential in the most literal meaning of the word. It was at exactly this moment that the Gulf states made their decision. After 4 weeks of incoming fire, after absorbing over 2,000 strikes in the UAE alone, after airports burned and gas terminals took damage and the global economy started bleeding, after that chilling demonstration of Iranian intelligence and reach, the Gulf leadership sat down and asked themselves one question: what is the most effective response we can actually make? On March 25, 2026, representatives of every Gulf Cooperation Council country walked into an emergency session of the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. And they did not soften their language. They did not hedge. They did not offer both sides framing or diplomatic ambiguity. They looked at the international community and named Iran directly, clearly, and on the permanent record of the United Nations. Kuwait's ambassador stood at that podium and told the 47-member council that the Gulf states were facing, quote, an existential threat to international and regional security, and that Iran's actions were a direct assault on international law and every nation's right to sovereignty. Saudi Arabia's representative called Iran's attacks a violation of the United Nations Charter with no exceptions and no gray areas. He said targeting a country that is not at war with you is a breach of every international agreement that exists. He said targeting Oman, a country that was literally hosting the peace talks designed to prevent this war, was a betrayal of every diplomatic process and proof that Iran could not be trusted to respect any negotiated framework. Qatar called the strikes a serious threat to human rights on a global scale. The UN's own human rights chief stood at that same podium and warned that this war was pushing the Middle East toward what he described as an unmitigated catastrophe. Then the 47-member council voted, by consensus, no dissent. The resolution condemned Iran's strikes on countries that were not participating in the conflict. It specifically named the closure of the Strait of Hormuz as an illegal attack on the global economy. And it formally demanded that Iran pay full financial reparations, real legal compensation, to every government, every business, and every ordinary person whose life had been damaged by Iranian missiles and drones. The United States had mentally prepared for two possible scenarios from the Gulf states. Either they would eventually lose patience and enter the war militarily, which would have dramatically expanded the conflict into a full regional war, or they would stay quiet and keep absorbing the damage, which was becoming increasingly unsustainable and deeply humiliating for governments that answer to their own populations. Washington had not modeled a third option, but that is exactly what the Gulf states delivered. They used the international legal system as a precision weapon. They created a permanent record on the books of the United Nations naming Iran as the aggressor in this conflict. They established a legal obligation for Iran to pay compensation that does not expire when the guns go silent. And they built a coalition of 47 countries formally condemning Iran's conduct, a coalition built not through military alliance, but through legal and diplomatic process. Iran cannot shoot down a UN resolution. Iran cannot bomb an international legal record, and Iran cannot simply ignore a formal global demand for financial reparations without that demand following Tehran through every post-war negotiation, every sanctions discussion, every attempt to re-enter international financial systems for years. But here's the part of this story that almost no major media outlet is talking about. The Gulf states going to Geneva was not only about Iran, it was a very deliberate signal to Washington. And the signal said this: the deal we had with you is broken, and we are here to announce that we need a new one. For decades, the arrangement between Gulf countries and the United States operated on a simple understanding. Gulf nations allowed America to build military bases on their soil. America's presence was the guarantee of protection. That was the deal that every Gulf government pointed to when their own populations asked why thousands of foreign soldiers were living on Arab land. And this war demonstrated brutally and conclusively that guarantee was not worth what everyone believed it was. America's bases did not prevent Iran from targeting Gulf countries. According to Iran's military logic, having those bases made Gulf countries legitimate targets in a war they never started and never wanted. Saudi Arabia got hit, the UAE was struck more than 2,000 times. Qatar's most important gas facility was damaged. Oman, which was actively hosting peace talks and trying to help both sides find a solution, was still hit by Iranian missiles. Hosting American forces did not protect any of them. It made them co-belligerents in a conflict they had no vote in starting. And now, according to Al Jazeera's reporting from inside Geneva, the GCC countries are actively seeking a formal role in the negotiations between the United States and Iran. They are not waiting to be informed of outcomes after the fact. They are demanding a seat at the table where the decisions are made. America sent Iran a 15-point ceasefire proposal delivered through Pakistan. The plan reportedly covers provisions for reopening the Strait of Hormuz, easing of sanctions on Iran, limits on Tehran's nuclear program, and a commitment from Washington not to pursue regime change in Tehran. Pakistan's own prime minister made a public offer to host direct talks between America and Iran in Islamabad and tagged both sides on social media to make the offer impossible to dismiss. An Israeli official confirmed that planning for those talks was reportedly underway. Iran publicly rejected the 15-point plan and denied that any negotiations were taking place at all, calling Washington's statements about ongoing talks completely fabricated. At the same time, multiple countries including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan had managed to establish quiet communication channels with Iranian officials. The diplomacy was continuing even as Iran refused to acknowledge it in public. Iran also added a condition that significantly complicated things. Tehran announced that any ceasefire deal must include Lebanon, effectively linking the Iran war to the separate ongoing conflict against Hezbollah in Lebanon, where Israeli operations were still continuing. Meanwhile, the military situation was not winding down. Thousands more American Marines were being deployed to the Gulf region. The U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division was preparing for potential Middle East operations. Reports surfaced that Washington was considering an operation to seize Iran's Karg Island, the terminal that handles the majority of Iran's remaining oil exports, which would effectively cut Iran off from its primary remaining revenue source. Israel said publicly that it wanted several more weeks of military operations against Iran before it would consider stopping, without specifying exactly what objective would satisfy it. And then there was the threat that was keeping Gulf governments up at night more than any other. Bloomberg reporting and regional sources indicated that Saudi Arabia and the UAE were privately discussing the conditions under which they might enter the war directly. The line that would trigger that decision was a strike on power plants and desalination facilities. In a part of the world where there is almost no naturally occurring fresh water, and where entire populations depend on energy-intensive desalination systems to have drinking water at all, an attack on those systems is not an economic strike. It is not infrastructure damage. It is an attack on human survival itself. That is the line. And Iran has already demonstrated it knows exactly where those facilities are. What this actually costs ordinary people. Something the big international outlets are largely glossing over is the full human cost of what this conflict has done to everyday people who had absolutely no part in starting it. Think about what happens to a country like Pakistan or Sri Lanka when oil prices jump 60% in less than 2 weeks. These are nations that import virtually every drop of fuel they use. When that cost nearly doubles, it does not stay in the petrol station. It moves into food delivery supply chains, factory production costs, cooking gas prices at home, and electricity bills for families who are already stretched. A 60% oil price spike is not an inconvenience for these populations. It is a genuine crisis that pushes millions of already struggling people measurably closer to the edge. The irony sitting at the center of all this is devastating. The Gulf states being hit by Iranian missiles are the same countries whose oil and gas exports keep developing economies across Asia and Africa running. The Strait of Hormuz closure was not an attack only on Gulf revenues. It was an attack on Japan, on India, on South Korea, on every European nation that built its energy security around Qatari LNG. The ripple spread to every country on Earth that buys fuel or food, which is every country on Earth. And that is another reason the Gulf states went to Geneva. By getting a formal international legal record naming Iran as the aggressor, they were sending a message to every investor, every multinational company, and every government still watching from the sidelines. The message was, we are the victims here. We did not choose this. The Gulf was not a war zone because of Gulf decisions. It became a war zone because of decisions made in Washington and Jerusalem that Gulf governments had no vote in making. That distinction matters enormously for the long-term economic future of a region that spent decades building its global reputation on one word above all others: stability. There is also pressure building inside Iran that rarely gets acknowledged in Western reporting. Before this war began, Iran was already dealing with serious internal unrest. Years of international sanctions had hammered the Iranian economy. The government had responded to large-scale domestic protests with force. A population that was already frustrated and economically strained is now also living through the physical and psychological reality of an ongoing military conflict on its own soil. Infrastructure is being damaged, cities are being struck, the economy is contracting at an accelerating rate. That internal pressure does not automatically mean Iran will back down. Governments under external military attack frequently see short-term spikes in nationalist sentiment. Populations often rally around leadership when bombs are falling from foreign powers. But internal economic misery is a different kind of pressure, and it compounds over time rather than fading. The calculations being made inside Tehran about how long this war can continue, at what cost, and toward what realistic objective, are being made in a context of domestic strain that adds another layer of complexity to every decision. America is under its own form of pressure that goes well beyond the battlefield. President Trump made explicit promises to his voters about avoiding long, costly foreign wars. He made statements about restoring stability and projecting strength without getting bogged down in open-ended conflicts. A war with Iran that has now lasted over a month, disrupted global energy markets, hit American consumers visibly at petrol stations and grocery stores, and has no clear end date or measurable endpoint is not the narrative any American president wants heading into midterm elections in November. The political calendar matters. It always matters. And a president who went on camera and declared that America had won the war while the war was visibly still ongoing is going to face some genuinely uncomfortable questions if a ceasefire is not locked in soon. Israel's position adds a final, complicated layer to all of this. Israel has stated publicly that it needs more time to achieve its military objectives inside Iran. But what exactly constitutes achieving those objectives remains deliberately vague. Permanently eliminating Iran's nuclear capability, destroying enough of its missile arsenal to remove the threat of future strikes, degrading Iran's ability to fund and supply regional proxy groups like Hezbollah. These are goals that are genuinely difficult to measure and even harder to declare complete with any credibility. And as long as Israel is conducting active military strikes inside Iran, Iran will keep retaliating, which means Gulf countries will keep getting hit, which means the pressure on Gulf governments to either enter the fighting directly or find increasingly aggressive alternative responses will keep growing. Here's what makes the Gulf states' Geneva move so significant in the long run. Whatever happens next, whether Iran accepts a ceasefire, whether the Strait of Hormuz reopens, whether the 15-point American proposal gets modified and eventually signed, whether the Gulf states are ultimately forced into direct military involvement or not, one thing has fundamentally and permanently changed. There is now a formal international legal record, voted on by consensus by 47 nations, naming Iran as the aggressor in this conflict, documenting what that aggression cost, and creating a legal obligation for reparations that does not disappear when a ceasefire is signed. In every post-war negotiation, every discussion about lifting sanctions on Iran, every conversation about Iran's path back into international financial systems and trade relationships, that record exists. It cannot be undone by a press release from Tehran. It cannot be erased by a claim that the attacks were justified. It is on the permanent books of the United Nations. The Gulf states have been patient, strategic, and measured throughout this entire crisis. They absorbed the hits without retaliating militarily. They defended their airspace. They kept communication lines quietly open. And then, at precisely the right moment, after 4 weeks of documented, quantifiable, internationally witnessed damage, they walked into a room in Geneva and made a move that no missile could have made for them. They went to the world and built a legal, financial, and moral case against Iran that will shape the post-war settlement for years, regardless of how or when the fighting stops. Whether the ceasefire talks in Pakistan succeed this week, whether Trump's 15-point plan gets modified and eventually accepted, whether oil prices come back down as the Hormuz situation resolves, whether the Gulf states are eventually pulled into direct military action, those answers are coming in the days and weeks ahead. But what we already know right now is this: 6 countries that had been absorbing missiles for a month found a way to strike back harder than any bomb could. They struck at Iran's international standing, its legal credibility, and its financial future all at once, without firing a single shot. And even the most powerful government on earth did not see it coming.